Greetings, YouTube. Today I'm going to review the latest book I have read, Sex. Real People Talk About What They Really Do by Harry Maurer, a Penguin book. Does what it says on the tin. Oh, guess that wraps that one up. You want more details than that, don't you? Yeah, I thought so. Alright, the book covers a number of interviews that the author did. This is not a scientific study. He was not trying to gather data for something. He was trying to figure out what specific Americans really have done in their sexual lives and present it to the reader in a completely frank and candid way. He did 120 interviews, and 52 of them ended up in the book. It's 540 pages long. Now, one of the things that is interesting about this, in my opinion, is that, at least in my experience, sex has always been about a distinct quanta. Whether you are having sex alone or with a partner, reading about it in a story, watching it in a pornography, talking about it with someone, sex has a distinct beginning, middle, and end. That usually doesn't take a whole lot of time. Rarely do you spend consecutive days reading about nothing but sex. Rarely do you spend 540 consecutive pages reading about sex. It was a very strange experience in that regard. Let's put it, at the end of this, I was all sexed out. The book covers the age ranges in his interviewees from 12 to, I think, 70 is what the age range was in there. The 12-year-old being the first interview he did, a 12-year-old virgin male, basically talking about his sex life being a solo sex life. And while it was interesting, it was also, I think, quite possibly maybe the most depressing story in the entire book, because even at age 12, the boy had already completely absorbed so much of our cultural baggage and firmly believed that sex is something that is only instigated by males, that women are completely passive in that regard. And that was depressing. But the book covers male, female, and people that fall inside and outside that spectrum. Gay, straight, bisexual, pansexual, omnisexual, people who just simply refuse to define themselves in any way, shape, or form. So you're talking about genderqueer people, people that have filled every possible conceivable niche in that spectrum, people who have had the most vanilla sex you can imagine and didn't discover oral sex until they were in their 50s, people that went to their wedding nights virgins, and people who lost their virginity when they were 13 or 14. People who have only had very vanilla sex, or people who have gotten into some of the really strange and bizarre practices that fall well outside what would be considered societal norms for short-term periods of their life and for long-term periods of their lives. It deals with sex workers. It deals with people who have been loyal and faithful to their partners, people who have never had a committed relationship, and people who have open relationships. In great measure, it covers pretty much everything you could think of on the topic of sex, and it was quite interesting. Now, I think for me, one of the most fascinating aspects of this, and I think the person here that I almost said character, and I guess she is a character in some ways, the healthiest person, I think, in this entire book that I read here may have been a woman who considers herself a priestess of Ishtar and works as a divine prostitute, literally sees herself as a prostitute that worships her deity through the act of prostitution. That's how she makes her living, and she sees it as an act of worship of her goddess. I thought that was quite fascinating. Also, I think that quite a few of the people that would fall outside the traditional heteronormative range may be healthier than a lot of the standard vanilla individuals in the book, because they've had to pursue the fringes of society, and that has exposed them to a much broader experience, and I think has given them a deeper depth of understanding in many ways. I have to tell you that I thought that the males in the book didn't fare as well as the females. A lot of the times the males seemed very clueless. A couple of them were very much like, I really have a lot of respect for women, or I'm looking for certain, solid relationships, and yet in the next couple of paragraphs they're using words like slut and whore. So that shows a lack of understanding. Or one individual who's young and fabulous, and he's attractive, and women want him everywhere, and he discusses how he wants a long-term stable relationship, all while having a woman on the side. I don't fault anybody for having as many relationships as you want, so long as you're honest with the people involved. And he isn't. He's all about infidelity. And that's a much bigger issue to me than the number of partners you had. And you've got people in this book who've had no partners, the 12-year-old I mentioned. The people who've only had a single partner in their entire career, sexual career, to one woman who's had over 1,000 partners. You have this one gentleman who went to his wedding night a virgin, and now as a middle-aged adult, he arranges sex parties for couples. So it shows how people's sex lives change over time. This was a fascinating book. Again, I think if I had really thought about reading 540 consecutive pages of sex, I may have wanted to break this up, maybe read it by chapter, which he does in groups, like 5 or 6 interviews per chapter dealing with a specific topic. And I think that would have probably made this a little more digestible and a little easier if I hadn't tried to consume it all at once. But I definitely recommend this book, particularly if you have an interest in sexual practices that may well fall outside your personal experiences. Then you want to be exposed to things that you would never be able to ask someone. If you, for example, you're curious about how other people have their sex lives, and you are not the type of individual to walk up to someone and say, "Hey, what do you do in bed?" Because let's face it, that's not a question you can ask most people. Even intimate friends don't necessarily discuss their own sex lives in great detail. So if you have an interest in this topic, and let's face it, who doesn't, you might well enjoy this book.